morning, everyone, and welcome to the Morning Coffee Podcast. I am your host, Brooke Carlock, and I am super stoked to have my guest here today. We are going to be talking to Annie Sklaver Orenstein. She's an author, a researcher, all-around badass, and today we are going to be talking to her about her book, which is called Always a Sibling: The Forgotten Mourner's Guide to Grief. So I read this and I absolutely loved it. I'm so excited to talk to Annie today. So I'm going to bring her on stage here. And welcome, Annie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course. I appreciate it. So, well, first I always ask, are you drinking anything this morning?
Oh, I am. I have finished my coffee and
right.
I have moved on to my emotional support water bottle with electrolyte.
Awesome. Okay. I always drink protein coffee in the morning, so I'm still sort of nursing mine at this point. So great. Well, I guess I'll start by letting you introduce yourself and kind of talk about the loss of your brother and how that impacted you and eventually led to your amazing book.
Absolutely. So, yeah. So for those who don't know me, I am the youngest of three. I have two older brothers, and that was very much my identity. Always was, having my big brothers, and they were, and are very much kind of my idols, my guideposts, all of that. And we're all 4 years apart. I'm the youngest. So Ben is 8 years older than me. Sam is 4 years older than me. And back in 2000, which feels like a lifetime ago, before, it was a different world then. For those of us who remember, my brother Ben joined the Army Reserves. He was studying international affairs and diplomacy, and he really saw the military as an infrastructure that could be used for good because it could get into the places that needed the most help. And so he joined the military with this very idealistic view. And a few months later, 9/11 happened, and suddenly we were at war, and that was very scary for all of us. So he had his first deployment in 2006 to the Horn of Africa, and he was called up on a stop-loss order in 2009 and to Afghanistan. And he went, and he was killed almost exactly 3 months into his tour. And he was killed by a suicide bomber. And when he was killed, it was like the whole world crumbled around us. I have had a very, very privileged upbringing. My parents are still married, 50 something years. And we all got along and, trauma free.
Right. Yeah.
And I remember always thinking something bad was going to happen because I was watching as, my friends' parents would get divorced or someone struggled with addiction or this or that. And I kind of always knew like, life doesn't work this way.
It's too good.
So it was too good. And there was a part of me that was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And, my therapist would tell me I was catastrophizing and blah, blah, blah. But it was like, no, this isn't how this goes. This isn't how this works. And then it happened. And I was like, no, this wasn't it. This was not the thing.
Take it back.
Like, this wasn't the thing. And, after years of thinking something bad was going to happen, something bad happened. And I was like, no, this is the wrong one. In the aftermath of Ben's death, I remember going, I struggled with any kind of support group or anything like that because everything felt very military oriented. And I didn't come from a military family. I didn't know other people in the military. And I felt like the military was how my brother died, but not how he lived.
Okay.
in his civilian, he was in the reserves, and in his civilian life, he worked for the CDC and he worked for FEMA, and his army identity was a 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year
Right.
thing. And a lot of the support that was kind of readily available was military, and I ran in the opposite direction. And I couldn't, but there was nothing else.
Yeah.
I remember going to bookstores and looking for a book that would help me. I thought I needed a book, and I remember looking through the index and the table of contents and just looking for the word sibling, and it was nowhere to be found in anything. And I felt, forgotten and invisible. And I took that to heart. I
Yeah.
figured publishing is a huge industry, and if they aren't putting out anything, then I must be the only one. Maybe this isn't a real thing. People treat me like I'm not really supposed to be grieving as much as I am, so maybe they're all right. And it wasn't until almost 10 years later that I kind of started working on the earlier versions of this book and exploring the idea of it. And what it eventually turned into was really the book that I needed. It was the book that I needed at that time, but also
Yeah.
I think the book that I needed in the years since then.
Yeah.
And that
That
was
was
how it
just
came
while
to
you were
be.
talking, it kind of reminded me, because the same thing, I wrote a book as well after I lost my daughter, and it was kind of the same thing. I wrote the book that I wanted to have but couldn't
Mm-hmm.
find. But I empathize. Can I just to clarify, how old were you
Mm-hmm.
when your brother died?
I was 25,
Okay.
and it was 3 weeks before his 33rd birthday.
It's so weird because that is the exact same ages that my sister and I were when my sister died. So
Wow.
yeah, it's just, and it's the same age gap. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it resonates. And I remember she died in 2000 and the very last days of 2002, and the same thing. Like I
Mm-hmm.
didn't feel like there was anything around, and at that
No.
time it wasn't as easy to you know hop on your phone and find information.
Exactly.
It wasn't there. We didn't
And
have
it
that.
was, and I don't know if you found this, but so this was 2009, and there weren't like Facebook groups on sibling loss. There weren't
Right.
podcasts on this stuff.
Exactly.
And like maybe if I had scoured the internet better, I could have found something, but I wasn't even using the internet that way at all.
Yeah.
Um, and so finding any kind of virtual support, was didn't cross my mind, and I
Right.
don't remember anyone suggesting it. It was just kind of off the radar. And as a result, I think after that, I never went back to look. I was never like 5 years later, I didn't think, oh, I wonder if now there are helpful groups online for
Right.
me. I just I didn't find them in that immediate aftermath, and I never went back to look again. And that's something that I regret is a strong word because I think I was doing my very best. But I kind of wish that either I had gotten the idea or someone had said to me, hey, it's not too late.
Right.
Because after a few years, I felt like, well, it's, it's not a new loss. I should be over it by now. So why would I go looking for these resources or anything
Yeah.
like that? And I think that was just, I feel, sad thinking about like late 20s Annie, who probably could have really used that, and who's to say one of those military support groups wouldn't have been helpful, right? Like some of them did
Right.
have stuff for siblings. And I had so much anger and resentment towards that whole institution. And, by 2009, 2010, 11, like the war was raging, and I didn't support it. No one in my family
Yeah.
supported it. And it was, um, I just didn't think that it was a group that could bring me any comfort.
Yeah.
And I don't know in hindsight if that's actually true or not, but you get very stuck in kind of your grief logic in that moment.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and you kind of look for what you want and what you need at the time. I'm super introverted, so the idea of going to support groups
Yes.
was a turn off for me right away.
Yes.
So it was kind of like I wanted a book. Books for me that's what helps. Like I love I love books that you can go back to it as many times as you need. And and I have to tell you, I absolutely adore the voice of your book. Like I felt like I knew you from reading it, and it was actually making me kind of chuckle because we kind of sound the same. My book, like it's very just down to earth and pragmatic and like kind of raw and honest and real, and that's kind of how mine is as well. So it was like, man, this is so like anyone who has lost a sibling like this, I would have loved having this when my sister died, because your voice is just right up my alley.
I kind of think about it because I really struggled with finding any kind of grief book that was helpful. And I kind of think of this as like a grief book for people who don't always kind of connect with self-help books or other grief books. Like this is a friend telling you the honest truth. This is not, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a professional. Right. I am a sister who lost a sibling and just so happens to be a researcher. And so I did a lot of, I ended up doing a lot of research and then I shared it. But much more kind of peer to peer.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to ask is I know like you interviewed a bunch of grieving siblings for the book. How did you find those people and what was that process like?
Yeah. So an earlier version of this book, an earlier proposal was very much kind of the story of me and Ben. Mm-hmm. And what we heard from publishers was, we're not necessarily interested in this, but you are right that there are no books for siblings. And if you'd be interested in writing a book for siblings, come back to us. And my knee-jerk reaction was, no, who am I to write that book? Because, like I mentioned, I had a very privileged upbringing. There was no trauma there. I had a beautiful relationship with my brother. My family, we got a lot of support after he died because he was a hero who, came back from service. And I had friends who lost siblings to addiction or mental health, and they did not have that experience. And so I felt like, how can I write this book? Right. Yeah. Again, I'm not a therapist and my experience is not universal. And so the proposal that I eventually put together was, it was all based on the idea that I would do these interviews and that I would, survey siblings and do these follow-up interviews so that I wasn't the one trying to speak to how to deal with a sibling who is struggling from addiction, but instead that would come from a sibling who experienced it.
Actually gone through it, yeah.
Exactly, because no one should hear me. I have no qualifications for that. I found it very daunting and a lot of pressure, and it seemed like the worst thing I could do was pretend like I knew what it was like. And so initially I shared out a survey, and I had some very wonderful friends who had much larger followings than I did on social media who helped to share. Emily Oster, if you know her, she's an author on parenting books. We went to elementary and middle school together.
Oh,
she was the same age as my middle brother. And, she knew our oldest brother and she was kind enough to share it. And that's when the survey really took off. So I got about over 350 responses and people really took the time and answered these long open-ended questions. And I had more data than I anticipated and it was an embarrassment of riches. And from there, after reading them all through, I did follow-up interviews with about 40 of the siblings, and it was very strategic, who I selected in my
Mm.
methodology, and it was, making sure I had older siblings, younger siblings, good relationships, fraught relationships, deaths at different life stages. So childhood, adolescence,
Right.
adulthood, late adulthood, and all of these different causes of death. And I did these series of follow-up interviews, and it was a very intense month. I
Mm.
felt like I needed to get them all done before I could start writing, and I had I had a year to get the book done, and I had my schedule. But at the same time, I was working full time, and I have 2 young kids, and so it was a lot of like work all day, get through bedtime, do these
Yeah,
interviews at night,
that's a
take a
lot.
day off from work and stack 4 of them in a row. It was a
Yeah.
very intense time, but it was really incredible. And that was the moment when I was like, oh, maybe a support group actually could have been great, because
Yeah.
having these conversations was even helpful for me, as much as it was, I think, for a lot of the people that I talked to. And so it was between those surveys, those follow-up interviews, and then I did a few interviews with professionals, with grief professionals like Claire Bidwell Smith, Gina Moffa, and then also uh, some experts in the field of like sibling dynamics and family relationships
Yeah.
that could help me unpack that. Um, and that was all done kind of in the early months where I had already sold the book, but now I had to go write it.
Yeah. You got some connections, girl.
You know what? It really it is. I don't know. I guess we can thank my elementary school.
Nice. That's
It worked out.
whatever works. Yeah, that's great.
Emily really she really helped. Yeah.
So from interviewing all these people and from what you experienced, you talk a lot about how sibling grief is kind of like the forgotten grief that
Mhm.
people don't really think about or pay attention to siblings. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that is?
Yeah, it was an interesting one, because there are certain things that came up in my research where I was like, what? Like, everyone knew this the whole time? The whole time? I
Yeah.
imagine that scene from Mrs. Doubtfire when Sally Field finds out that her husband has been Mrs. Doubtfire, and she's like, the whole time? The
Yeah.
whole time? I had a lot of those moments in my research, and one of them was when in addition to all the interviews, I read every study there was on sibling loss, which
Yeah.
there aren't that many. There aren't enough, but I devoured them all. And they kept referring to siblings as the forgotten mourners. It
Mm.
was like the term for siblings. And I'm sitting there thinking, you all knew this the whole time? And yet nothing has
And
changed,
yeah.
right? We are still, and what it means by forgotten mourners is that no one thinks of the siblings. People, even to the sibling, right? So part
Mhm.
of it is a very universal experience. I would be amazed if you didn't experience this, but please tell me, is that people find out that you lost a sibling, and their first question is, how are your parents?
Yep. Absolutely.
And every once in a while, you have someone who also asks about you.
Right.
But for the most part, the question is, how are your parents? The
Yes.
were they married? Did they have kids, right? If so, then they ask about the spouse and the child.
Yeah, that
But
was how it
still,
was
there's
for
no
my
question
sister.
about you.
Yeah. Yep.
And when you get that enough times, you kind of assume that you're supposed to be fine.
Yeah.
And you get that enough times, and then there are no books about it, and no one talks about it, and no one checks in on you. And it is very literally, people forget that siblings grieve. And especially, I think, as adults, although it is unfortunately also true for children. Um, and even for a lot of folks, and I was very fortunate because my parents did really put a lot of weight on our grief, but um a lot of times parents forget that their children are grieving.
Yeah.
I talked to someone who said that her dad called her about 6 months after her brother died, very apologetically, and said, "I am so sorry. I just realized that you lost someone too."
Yeah.
And this is
Oh,
6 months
it's
later
sad,
and a
but yeah,
father,
it's true.
right? And there was someone else who told me that, people would always check in, with him about his parents, but he didn't realize until, again, it was like 6 or 8 months after his brother died, and a friend called to just see how he was doing. And he said it wasn't until that phone call that he realized no one else had asked that question.
Mm.
And that's the kind of uh, treatment and behavior that leads to this feeling of being a forgotten mourner.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird because I kind of have the unique perspective of seeing it having lost my sister, experiencing that sibling loss myself, which exactly what you're saying. Like people didn't pay attention to me at all. It was it was my parents and more importantly, which I understand, she had, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old and everyone was worried about them, including me.
Mhm.
But now that, I've also lost my 10-year-old daughter, so and I've had to watch my sons go through losing their sister. And it's
Mhm.
been interesting what you're saying. Like my middle son was 16 when Libby died, and not a lot of people ask about him. But
Mhm.
my oldest son, Max, was 18 and he was driving the car when his sister was killed. So people ask me all the time about him because he was like
Mhm.
directly involved. But it is strange because not a lot of people remember that I have another
Yeah.
son that's also experiencing that loss.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is. And I'm having worked with a lot of siblings and gone to conferences and stuff. Yeah, siblings definitely. There's actually the Compassionate Friends, their sibling group
Mhm.
is huge. They are
Mhm.
very vocal about it, and I hadn't thought about it much until I started encountering, the different sibling groups, and they all kind of say that same thing. Like people forget that we're
Yep.
here. And did you
And
feel a sense because I know my sons like they didn't want to show me how sad
oh,
they
yeah.
were because they didn't want to make me more upset. They were
Yes.
more worried about me.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's a a lot on this in the book because one thing that I kind of posit is that the forgotten mourner, the siblings as a forgotten mourner is partly on the sibling.
Mm,
We can sometimes do a very, very, very good job pretending we're fine and
yeah.
pretending we're not grieving. And that is so common. And so it almost no one is to blame. I don't want to say this and make it seem like the surviving sibling is to blame for being ignored, but in a way it feels like a prison of our own making
Mm,
where we can sometimes do a really good job pretending we're fine for exactly that reason.
yeah.
And then suddenly years later you're like, "Wait, I'm not at all fine." And
Yeah.
and you can do such a good job that you even convince yourself that you're fine until there's a kind of triggering event or something and you realize you haven't done any grieving. And
Yeah.
that's a big part of why some of the more kind of complex forms of grief, like delayed grief,
Yeah.
is so much more common in siblings, is because we immediately jump to action, right? There are a lot of siblings who were the ones in charge of planning the funeral and doing all of these things, and you're taking care of your parents and you're taking care of in your case like surviving nieces and nephews, and you
Yeah.
jump to action to do all of these things. But then in a lot of cases what happens is those other people are able to process their grief, and you don't. You just kind of sit on it and suppress it. And I had one interview where she said it really, really well, that it had been 7 years, and she suddenly realized that her parents could talk about her brother with a
Mhm.
smile on their face. They could talk about him and reminisce, and, feel good about it. And she still couldn't say his name without crying.
Yeah.
And it was this moment of like, how did we get here? And and her mom had said something like, well, um, it seemed like you were always fine. Like it wasn't, a problem. And on the one hand, like, come on, mom, how
Yeah.
could anyone
Like,
possibly be okay? Like,
right.
no
Yeah.
one is fine. That's wishful thinking. So again, there's a lot of, there's a lot of complexity there, but she had this moment where she was like, I haven't grieved at all. I'm way behind all of these people in my family because I was so focused on them that I never did anything for myself.
Yeah. Well, I love because in the book you include like different exercises and things like that for siblings to do with
Hmm.
that in mind. Like you've probably postponed a lot of your grieving.
Yeah.
And if you're reading this, it's going to bring a lot of that back up. So these are some of the things that you can do. Can you kind of talk about a little bit about some of like the exercises? You call it's mum, right? That you use the
Yes. The
acronym.
mourner's user manual.
There we go. I love that. I love a good
And
acronym.
I'm not gonna lie, the cynic in me, I had a hard time, originally the kind of having exercises was like, this is the thing that practical nonfiction books have, or exercises.
Right.
And at first I was like, does anyone actually do the exercises? Like, what is the point here? And I talked about it a lot with my editor, and who was incredible, and coincidentally had also lost a sibling, which we
Mm,
didn't know when we queried her. Um, and she kind of said, you don't need to have them for every chapter, but just think if there's like something helpful that people can do. And what the exercises ended up being were things, writing the book and the experience of writing the book and researching and all of these things were so incredibly helpful in my own grief. I
right.
made, my grief transformed 180 degrees in, the 5 years since I've been working on the book versus the 10 years before then. And
Yeah.
so the exercises in a lot of ways ended up being either things that I did during the writing of the book that turned out to be incredibly helpful that I just would recommend for people. Um, Things that other people said they had done where I thought, man, I wish I had thought of that.
Wish
I
I
wish
would
I
have
had
known
done that
about that.
earlier.
Yeah.
Right. Or things where I just kind of, after knowing everything I now know, thought like, I wish someone had told me to do this. So again, it
Yeah.
was, the exercises were also, the things that I wish I had known, and the things I wish I had done. And the user manual is very much like, you have these moments when you're grieving where you're suddenly completely overwhelmed because you don't know how to answer a question or you don't know what to do.
Right.
And it's questions like, how many siblings did you have? Or
Mhm.
do you have? Or, even just people asking, how they can help. And for me, when I am asked those questions and I have to answer in the moment, my mind goes blank. It's like when someone asks you your favorite movie and you're
Yeah.
suddenly like, what is a movie?
Well, yes.
I've never seen a movie ever in my entire life. Um, and that would always happen to me, right? And so if someone said, "Can I help?" or whatever, I would say no because my mind was blank, not because I didn't need help.
Right.
And so the user manual is kind of encouraging people to kind of take back control, and it's like, here are a lot of the questions you are going to get asked, and here are a lot of the situations you're going to be in. And so if it's helpful for you, instead of waiting until you're in that moment, think through how you would want to answer it in advance. And then when someone asks that question,
Be
you can
prepared.
change your mind in the
Yep.
moment, but also like you've kind of thought about it before, and you're not immediately put on the spot, right? And so uh, things like you know do you like visiting the cemetery or not? There are some people who find no value in it. It is not helpful. It only makes things worse. and yet they find themselves going again and again because their parents want to go or whatever.
Yeah.
And so thinking that through, do you genuinely find comfort in the cemetery? And if not, here are some tools, here are some things that you can do to help, you know, have that conversation,
Yeah.
so that you don't need to necessarily do that. And, everything from that to like, what if a friend asks you if they can help?
Right.
What are some
What-
ways that they can help? Brainstorm them now and then
Yes.
open the notes app in your phone and you have some ideas.
I love it. I love it because they're all like super practical
Very practical.
ideas to help people that are going through it, which is great.
Yes. Yes.
So, can you talk a little bit about the way that you organized the book? So, it's divided up into 3 sections, and I want to say, is it with, without, and within? Is that right?
Yes.
Something like
Absolutely.
okay. Yeah. Can you explain kind of what those different sections are?
Yeah. So it became very clear to me in a lot of my interviews that kind of, as I mentioned earlier, siblings were very quick to dismiss their own grief,
Mhm.
you know, that, um, you know, I, I had a lot of responses in the survey where when I asked about the sibling relationship, they would say we weren't close at all. If we weren't sisters, we wouldn't be friends. And then the same people, when you say, what impact has the loss had on you, they'll say, it's the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I
Yeah.
felt like I lost a limb. Nothing has ever been the same. It, those two they don't inform each other, right?
Yes.
It doesn't matter if you had a good relationship or not. In a lot of situations, if you had a bad relationship, your grief becomes even more
Right.
complicated.
Makes it complicated.
But these conversations when I would do the follow-up interviews, would start with all of these qualifiers, like, well, it wasn't as bad as for my parents, or, we weren't that close anyway, or whatever it was. And so I realized very quickly that before I could get anyone to really kind of explore their grief and face their grief, I needed them to feel permission to grieve in the first place. And I needed them to feel like it's okay for me to feel this bad, even though we weren't close. It's okay for me to grieve, even though we had a complicated relationship. And so, with is that is getting the goal of with is to get people to the place where they can own their loss. And so there's a lot of focus on kind of the sibling relationship itself, and a lot of
Yep.
the kind of science behind why it's so impactful, and processing a lot of the things that happened in your sibling's life. So, processing some of those more difficult times and the more strained relationships, but really with the goal of making people feel like I am allowed to grieve this loss.
Mhm.
Then we move to without, which really focuses on the acute grief and that kind of initial period of loss, where there is anger, where there is deep sadness, and it also looks at kind of the changing relationship with your parents and family dynamics. And then within is about how we move forward with our siblings in our lives as much as is healthy.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of talk of continuing bonds and how we can kind of continue to feel their presence. And
Yeah.
there's also a lot of, I hope, kind of permission and encouragement in there that not all relationships should continue. Sometimes continuing bonds are actually unhealthy and detrimental. And so maybe there should be a continuing bond. Maybe the bond should be cut, and we need to figure out how to move forward in a different way,
Yeah.
and that you're not always going to have good memories. It's not always a good relationship. And so how do we grieve those imperfect people and imperfect relationships, and how do we then carry it forward into our
Right.
lives?
Yeah, I love that. So we have a question here from one of our viewers that kind of, I'm going to throw it up there now because in the section about the continuing bonds, I think this is what he is hinting at. So Victor says, I think what he's asking, have you transit life after death topics like NDEs and stuff? If so, did it help? So I know you talk about, and this is not my area of expertise at all, so I will defer to you, because I know in the book you talk about signs and going to a medium and things like that, which is not, I'm very much a pragmatist, so that is not my wheelhouse, but I know from the book that you found those things very helpful. So maybe if you want to answer Victor there, if it helped you.
NDEs are near-death experience?
I think that's near-death experience. Yeah.
I
don't know. When I see life after death, I don't know. It just, when I saw that, I was thinking, oh, maybe that would be some of the signs and medium stuff that you had in there.
I think, like, so I went to a medium 10 years after Ben died, and I was very much a skeptic. A friend had convinced me to do it. And I did find it shockingly helpful. And I do believe in signs and seeing signs. But the thing about signs is that I have no idea if they're real. I have no idea if it's true.
Yeah.
There's also no proof that they're not, but there's no proof that they are. It could all be placebo. It could all be me seeing what I want to see, believing what I want to believe. Yeah. But at the end of the day, what I know is that when I see or experience something that feels like it could be a sign, it makes me smile. It warms me, and it kind of fills my heart a little bit. It fills that empty bucket a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters, right?
Exactly.
Is that there's this thing that happened that made me remember my brother in a way that makes me smile, which is not always how we remember them, right? Sometimes the memories are around their death, which in my case was extremely traumatic. And I think that anytime there is something that reminds me of my brother in a positive way that makes me smile, I'm just going to cling to it and call it a sign or call it whatever. I'm going to believe it. And so that has been really helpful. But I think that's kind of the extent to which I have explored that, is like finding what makes you feel good and remember them with a smile and kind of hold on to that.
Yeah, I think everyone grieves differently, and it doesn't, like you're saying, it doesn't matter exactly what you believe as long as what you believe is helpful for you.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's Victor. That's kind of how I would answer that one. If it helps you, then it's helpful. That's, you gotta, a lot of grief is about trying things to figure out what works.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Okay, one thing, because we're running a little bit low on time, but I want to make sure I ask you, this is just for my own personal amusement. The song titles that you have at the beginning of your chapters are like, it was like a who's who of all of my favorite singers and bands. So did you pick them?
You and Ben,
because you have really good taste.
So Ben, my brother, was very into music. Specifically, he was very into lyrics. And he kept a lot of diaries, and in his diaries, he would always include lyrics, song lyrics. And so for them, I think there are 15 chapters. I want to say at least 13 of the 15 are artists that he referenced in his journals. Most are songs specifically that either he referenced in his journals or that came up when I was talking to his friends, of memories from him or whatever. And then there are one or two that I added in because the lyrics were just too perfect. And actually, I had lyrics in most of the chapters, but for legal reasons had to take them out. And so the song titles and the kind of epitaph that was like a sentence or two were our way to get around that. And so I created a playlist that went along with the book so that people could kind of hear and see those lyrics, even though I couldn't include them in full.
That's amazing. That was the other thing I was thinking, because after writing my book, I had some song lyrics in mine, and the amount of money that I had to pay to get the license to print those lyrics, I was like, holy cow. But yeah, it was funny because I'm flipping through and I'm like, man, she has good taste. So it was Ben. It was Ben's. We must have.
It was mostly Ben. It was mostly Ben.
All right. Well, Ben he harkened back to like my high school and college days with the songs that he enjoyed. Yep. So, two more things I kind of want to get through if we can get them quickly. One, I know the book for me was super helpful. Like writing my book was therapeutic for me. And you said that it was kind of that way for you. How can you talk a little bit about how the book and the response to the book has changed your grief?
Yeah. I went from feeling Ben's absence to feeling his presence.
Oh, I love that.
That's the biggest way I could describe it. That for a long time, Ben's absence felt like a Ben-shaped hole. And I didn't want it to get smaller. And I didn't, the idea of like healing it or something felt wrong because it was like that Ben-shaped hole was what I had left. So I didn't want it to close up or anything. And through writing the book, through having these conversations, whether it's with people from his past or with others, and finding these, ways to feel connected to him and these reminders of him and all of that, it's like they've all started to fill the Ben-shaped hole with things that bring me comfort. And so the hole is still there. It's not any smaller. It's not going anywhere, but it's not empty anymore.
Yeah.
And so where I used to really focus on his absence and the fact that he wasn't there anymore, now I can see more kind of moments of his presence or feel that or remember his life instead of only his death. And it's certainly not all the time. I mean, I had a real big grief cry this morning, and I can't even tell you why or what set me off. And I hadn't had one like that in a while. So, but I think the book, in many ways, the process of writing the book felt like it gave me Ben back.
Yeah.
Because I was reading his diaries and I was talking about him to people, and I was, talking to people from his life, and he became a very active part of my life again.
Yeah.
And that was really incredible.
Yeah. What a gift those diaries must be. Oh my gosh.
I know.
Have those.
I know. It makes me more committed to keeping my own, because I think about, and I will say I do keep journals, but I certainly like write in them thinking my kid's going to read this one day.
Yeah.
It's fine, but they really are a gift.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to ask is, so if you were to meet, or if you are running into people who are early in their sibling grief journey, is there any advice that you would offer those people?
First and foremost, just allow yourself to grieve. Your grief matters, and ignore all the qualifiers. It doesn't matter if you saw if you knew their death was imminent. It doesn't matter if you had a bad relationship. You will grieve imperfect people. You will grieve imperfect relationships. I think at a lot of times you grieve what you never had.
Yeah.
And the more we diminish our own grief, it just, I say this a lot in the book, but we cannot outrun grief. It will chase us down. And it might be a few years from now or a decade from now, but it will find you.
Absolutely.
So allow yourself to grieve and find the way to grieve that works for you. You don't have to do what works for other people. You can figure out your own way. But allow yourself to feel that.
I love it. Thank you so much. Well, Annie, I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
you taking the time to be on the podcast. And again, I will hold the book up. It is always a sibling. Where can people find the book and where can people find you?
They can find the book anywhere. Bookshop.org, Amazon, hopefully your local bookstore. If not, ask them to stock it. But the book is available everywhere. And you can find me on Instagram at Annie Sklaver Orenstein.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again. And thank you, everyone, for watching the Morning Coffee podcast. We hope you have a great day and we will see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.